Welcome to Reels on the Rocks, the show where we discuss films from the unpretentious perspective. We're your hosts, Whiskey and Sweet Tea, and today we will be examining Danny Boyle's zombie classic, 28 Days Later. Please be advised, spoilers are ahead. Welcome back. We are going to be talking about 28 Days Later. This was a pick of Whiskey's. Why don't you go ahead and tell us about it a little bit?
Well, how can you not pick this after everything that's going on? This was the first movie to come to mind. There's plenty of pandemic-type movies. Another one that's really good that I was thinking about doing was Contagion, which came out a few years ago.
Favorite of my dad's.
But as I've mentioned previously on this show, I'm a bit of a horror junkie, so why not go for something a little spookier? And this came out, so for anyone who isn't familiar with this movie, it kind of reignited the whole zombie craze back, a few decades ago, like early 2000s. Basically every zombie movie that came out afterwards was trying to copy this movie. Most notably, 2 years later in 2005, there was a remake of Dawn of the Dead, which was directed by everyone's favorite director, Zack Snyder. And it was a virus. The zombies could run. They were way more aggressive. It was a fairly decent movie. I wouldn't put it above the original, but it was straight up ripping off 28 Days Later.
Yeah.
And I felt a little bad recommending this because it turns out Sweet Tea is not a big zombie fan.
Yeah. We all have our own personal fears. One of mine is the breakdown of society. But, I did give it a try. I watched it, and I wasn't as scared as I thought I would be. Once I really sat down and thought about it, and we'll get into what we each think of the movie, what our different views on it are. But I would recommend this movie for people to watch right now. And we'll get into why.
It's got a lot of things. I thought of it just because of the virus, but after rewatching it, there's so many other elements that really speak to how things are right now. I will get into that, especially with some technical things. But before I explain some of the reasoning for how they made the movie, I am curious what you think, just without me explaining any of the decisions or any of the nitty-gritty stuff. Just what was your feeling going in, like after finishing it? What's jumped out at you the most? Because for me, this is probably the 20th time I've seen this movie, but this was your first time. So what? So
as you know, I'm very affected by zombie movies. So this wasn't like my first zombie movie. My first one would have to be Pride and Prejudice and Zombies.
Oh, excellent.
I actually enjoyed that one. I know that wasn't, a big favorite of everybody's, but it was the one that I enjoyed. And I will be totally honest, when I finished the movie, I was a little depressed. I actually was. I went and talked to my family, because they've seen it, and they enjoy, Contagion, all those kind of movies. And after talking with them about it, and really stopping to think about what the movie is saying, it's actually a very good world message. And it's a very good, even on a personal level, message to put out there, and I'll tell you why that is later.
Well, especially like Hollywood movies and stuff, the protagonist has what they call a character arc, and in this one, pretty much when we meet our protagonist, he's just woken up from a coma. He's exploring around, which is some of the most iconic imagery in the whole movie, but he meets up with two survivors and things happen. But at one point earlier in the movie, he's speaking with one of the survivors who's very cold, very, if you're falling behind, I will let you die sort of mentality. So there's a discussion the character has with this character, and she says, when the virus hits you, you have like 20 seconds to react.
Right.
And this is right after one of the other survivors was macheted to death, essentially, by her. And she's like, if the same thing happens to you, no hesitation.
In a heartbeat.
In a heartbeat. And he's like, well, I wouldn't do that to you. His whole thing, it's his character arc is more of becoming sort of a leader. Like, for most of the movie, he's following other characters. First, it's the survivors, then it's our favorite character, Frank, then it's the army. and by the end of the movie he becomes a predator himself, and he's able to like dish out orders as well as take them. And the survivor he was talking to sort of ends up being his love interest, and that was kind of a clever thing too. He appears to be infected even though he's not, and after taking out an enemy, so to speak, he sort of lunges for her and she hesitates. So it takes more than a heartbeat for her.
I think that's what he says. I think he even says that was more than a heartbeat.
so it's interesting. There's sort of a dual character arc going on there. But that, as our protagonist, is kind of the emotional core of the movie, is like not giving up on people, and that hesitation not being a weakness, and about trying to get everyone to pull through at the same time. And notably, and part of the reason I suggest it, because I knew Sweet Tea had a bit of a problem with zombie movies, and the thing I got for you to watch this was saying it has a happy ending. Now, the funny part about that is that was actually studio mandated. The original ending was actually basically them escaping this military compound, and that's it. Like, we don't know what happens to them or anything like that. But the studio was like, that's too depressing. So we need a little happiness, and I actually think it was a good idea. And
not only is that depressing, I also feel with the type of movie that this is, it's a very unsatisfying ending as well.
Say what you will about the sequel, I think it's got its benefits and some other stupider elements to it, but it sort of set up the sequel pretty well. One of the military people we see at this compound is talking about how he sees airplanes flying over, the world's going on with itself, and it takes place in the UK, so it's on this island, and he's like, the world isn't ending, we're just being quarantined. And everyone else is kind of like, the rest of the world is like this. So the ending is essentially that this is what actually is the case. They were being quarantined, and after another 28 days later happens.
This is all in the sequel.
Basically, the sequel, it's called 28 Weeks Later.
Yeah.
And it's
creative titling.
So the creative titling, which is brought over from this movie, is it has an opening scene much like this movie that takes place during this pandemic. And something, tragic happens, and then it says 28 weeks later. So this is like months later. So well after everyone survived and stuff. And essentially, it's them just trying to bring back people into the UK after it's all been deserted. Yeah. And of course, zombie hijinks ensue, and it happens all over again. But I think the reason I didn't like the sequel as much, and most fans didn't, is because it's not really a horror movie. It's sort of an action movie.
Yeah,
because the characters in that movie have a military person kind of like taking out zombies for them, and it's they're in danger, but it's not as desperate as the first movie, and I think that's what upset most people. I think it's a fine movie. Honestly, the opening scene in that movie is on par with the first movie. And I think that actually made it worse for me and other people because we were expecting the same. And then when it just became a completely different movie, it was extra disappointing. So for them to set the bar so high was kind of the problem. But I think the happy ending was a good choice. And I guess I'll get into some of the technical stuff. This is director Danny Boyle, and if you haven't seen any of his other movies, he's done Trainspotting, he did Slumdog Millionaire, he did 127 Hours. So he's pretty big. He's been nominated for some Oscars, he's won some Oscars. And what really jumped out about this movie to him was the creative title, first of all. We mentioned it already, but essentially the title doesn't really appear in the movie. There's an opening scene that sets up how the virus got out, and then it just says 28 days later, and the movie just keeps going. So that really interested Danny Boyle, and he also really liked the virus itself, and that it was called Rage, and how it was almost sort of a manifestation of just social unrest, and how it was just almost this metaphysical thing that obviously in the functionality of the movie, it's a literal virus, but it was supposed to be kind of symbolic of just how this was 2003, so this was right after like 9/11. Things aren't quite as chaotic as they are right now.
Yeah.
But at the time, it felt like it was, and so that's the other. The writer of this movie is Alex Garland. He wrote one of my favorite movies of 2018, Annihilation, and directed it. He also wrote and directed Ex Machina, for any of you who've heard or seen it, highly recommend both of those movies. But before he was a director, he was a screenwriter, and this was one of his first breakout hit scripts that he wrote. And yeah, like it was all supposed to be kind of, symbolic for all of these other things. The thing about this movie that I think is really cool, and I'm wondering if you noticed this, but so a thing that was happening back in the early 2000s is there was this big debate going on over digital versus film. And
I'd say that's still going on.
It's still going on. I think it's lessened a little bit because my opinion, and I will get into this as I'm discussing this, but it's what kind of story are you trying to tell, and why does film or digital or however you want to, shoot the thing really apply to the story you're telling. And there were plenty of directors at the time, like Quentin Tarantino, who's still really big. He's really into film. One of his friends, Robert Rodriguez, is a huge proponent of digital. Like, he's like, there's no reason to shoot in film. You have a lot of people with like big opinions on this, but my opinion, it's kind of the same as like special effects, like practical versus CGI.
Right,
it's like, what is the story you're trying to tell? And with this, Danny Boyle wanted this to look almost like news footage. And so when you're watching the news, it's all pixelated, it's very dirty. And so he purposefully picked digital because he wanted it to look like it was real, quote unquote. And he thought like news footage would
digital
be the right
or
way.
film?
Digital.
Okay.
And because of that, he was able to move the camera a lot more because the digital camera was a lot lighter than it would be. And also, he was able to stage the camera in some ways so that it almost looked like CTV footage. So it was like a mix.
Oh, yeah.
It was like a mix of cameras in kind of weird angles that almost looked like security cameras or whatever, mixed with handheld cameras, and all edited frenetically. There's two paces in this movie. There's so fast you don't know what's going on, and then there's very slow and serene and almost surreal. And that's kind of the thing. Like whenever they're on their road trip and they're just winding through the hills and stuff, it's all very dreamlike. But as soon as the action happens, it's kind of like the news footage you see at the very beginning of the movie. When you're in the lab and these experiment monkeys are like watching all of these like riots, the footage looks exactly like the action you're going to see with the zombies. It's all very chaotic, very like choppily edited together. It's all very pixelated because of the sort of news cameras digitally, feeding. Yeah. And so that was a creative choice that I think really pays off with the movie. And I think some people might say like, oh, it doesn't look as good because, it was with digital cameras from the early 2000s. Filming on digital is something that really loses any quality in the movie. I think the stylistic choice really adds to kind of this feeling of it being almost like a real pandemic happening. And, despite the fact that everyone's been evacuated or is now one of the quote unquote zombies, you're getting the news footage through the movie kind of to you. So that was sort of an interesting little thing. Oh, and fun fact, actually, the bit where he's on the bridge and you can see Big Ben and all that, they didn't even have to shut down any traffic for that. They actually shot it. It's supposed to be sunset in the movie. It's sunrise. I guess London works differently. Apparently, they did have people close, the road or whatever, but all they did was just shoot at a time when no one was like, it was so early, no one was headed to work yet. Yeah. Which is crazy to me. And that was the other thing too, because of shooting digitally and having the cameras be very portable and easy to carry, they were able to shoot on the streets of London quick. Like they were able to do like several takes in like 30 minutes, so they didn't even have to shut down things. Yeah. So even just from a practicality sort of thing, like if they had, shot on film or whatever, it would have probably seemed a little bit more unrealistic, and they would have had to take hours to shoot the same sort of thing.
It was interesting, and I know this has nothing to do with the movie, but that scene where he is walking on the bridge, and like you said, he's just walking and there's nobody around. I remember thinking, okay, so they took their souvenir cards, but they left the souvenirs. I was very confused by that.
It's so really funny that he sees a news headline talking about an evacuation, and he just kind of like
Yeah, he's
groans,
like,
and then
he's
he
like,
drops it. It's
he's
like,
okay.
what? Read it.
I would want to read more, and I would want to know why there is suddenly nobody.
Well, and not
nobody
5
around.
minutes later, he wanders into a church with a bunch of infected, and it's like, dude, maybe you should have read so you know why people evacuated.
Yeah.
Anyway, but and that's another thing too. I don't know if the Walking Dead comics came out before this movie, but that's another thing that might have copied this movie, because obviously, if you watch the TV show, you know that the premise is almost exactly the same, with Rick waking up from a comic. Or
A coma.
from a coma, waking up from his comic. No, waking up from a coma and then discovering how everything is. That's exactly the way this movie was. And I know it's actually from the comic, from what I understand. So I don't know if the comic came out before this movie, but if it didn't, I would suggest that maybe the authors were a little inspired from this movie, just like every other zombie movie that came out after this.
What you just reminded me of something I want to talk about with the church scene. Watching this movie and thinking about it and having a first opinion and then a second opinion when you stop thinking about it, there are two very distinct ways this movie can be interpreted. Very, very pessimistic, or it's very optimistic, however you look at it. Pessimistically, if you think about it, this is a movie that is saying hope is essentially futile. We start off with him rolling into this church, which symbolizes religion, and that's where people turn to during times of crisis, and everybody in the church is either dead, or I think there's 4 zombies in there. So already it's saying hope is futile. And then when he goes to his parents' house, and his parents gave up hope, so they were able to die on their own terms. They committed suicide. And then we proceed forward. He meets this father and their daughter, Frank, and I think it's Hannah. Is that her name? Hannah. And, they were listening to a broadcast from a supposed military installation somewhere. Well, they say where it's at. It's in Manchester, I think.
Yes.
And so they're like, if we get there, we can figure out what to do, or we can at least get help. So they set off in this road trip. Like you said, Whiskey, it's very surreal. It's very beautiful. It's actually one of my favorite sequences. They have a almost rom-com like shopping spree, which of course I appreciated. And then
those are radiated apples that
yes,
haven't rotted away.
that was a great scene. I loved that. And so, as a viewer watching that, you feel like you start to feel hopeful for the characters moving forward. You feel like almost like the cloud of the city has been lifted. You even look at the coloring they chose. They're brighter. They're not these grays and blacks and blues that we saw in the city. Everything was very muted there. So everything's bright out here. We see horses running free. Then they finally get to Manchester. First thing that happens is
the city's on fire.
The city is on fire, and Frank, the guy who was hoping this whole time that this would be their saving point, their rescue, gets infected and is immediately shot like 36 times.
Which is another, it's so, they're wondering where the soldiers are, the food is still hot, and it's just one of those just dramatic irony moments where, of course, they come back right after he gets infected. We learn some things about the soldiers and their motives, so it's entirely possible they were waiting for something to happen before they jumped into action. Who knows? But the fact that seconds after he's infected, when you watch this, you see the character of Frank, you feel really, really bad for this guy. And the main character, Selena and Hannah, they're all taken to the safe place they were promised in the broadcast. And they get there, and then they find out these people are essentially a militaristic cult who just want to... So you talked about hope, and I feel like that's kind of a good point to bring up with these soldiers, because they have lost all hope. There's, the one, I guess he's like a captain or something.
I believe his name is West.
Yeah, and he's the only one who really says he hasn't lost his mind. He's the one saying, there's planes flying over. We can hear radio broadcasts. The rest of the world is going on as usual. They've just quarantined us. And all the other soldiers are like, no, this is the end of the world. And because they've, lost all hope, essentially any sort of just goodness, they're almost the most nihilistic group of soldiers. They're just like, we're all that's left. We're gonna take what we want. We're gonna do what we want. and we're the ones with the power, and there's nothing you can do about it. And essentially, the twist that we learn is that the message was sent out for women because one of the soldiers had attempted to commit suicide, and so commanding officer promised them women. And of
Which,
course,
by the way, is gross. Women are not commodities.
Exactly. And one of the two women is very underage as well, which adds an extra
whole
dark
level of creepy to it.
So it's one of those things where like hope is an important kind of theme in the movie and sort of shows how just society crumbles when you assume there's nothing left to live for.
But here's the thing. So that was I believe they were all either members of the army. I don't think they were like vigilantes.
No, they were definitely actual
members of the army. So we have this military group that is behaving in this way, and then while there, the main character discovers the truth about what these people are. And when he tries to alert Selena and Hannah about it, he's immediately like shut down. And
except for that other captain or whatever he was, the one soldier who hasn't lost his marbles is attempting to stop them as well, because it's him and our protagonist.
That's true. They're both being executed.
Jim, who go out, and the soldier is shot. Jim gets away, but there you go. The one soldier who was like, I think he was in the army. Before the army, he was like studying philosophy or theology or something. So he's like sort of the one with more of a thoughtful sort of side.
And even before this moment, he stands out.
Yes.
And so while he's escaping, though, he falls back and he jumps over a wall and he's running. He trips and he looks up and he sees one of the planes. And when that happens,
he realizes
here's my thing. There are two ways to interpret that scene, and that's where there's very two different ways to do it. So the first one, if you're going from the pessimistic view, that is essentially the same thing as that serves as the same thing for this character that the broadcast served for Hannah and Frank. A message of hope that there is help out there. And if you really think about it, when we get to the end of the movie and we see that it's a fighter jet, immediately I'm thinking back, well, the last time they hung out with what they thought was the military, look what happened. And the fact that the movie ends before they're rescued, you could interpret that to mean that they're just going to go through the same thing again. There is no actual help or, progress here. And some people say, oh, well, you see them dying. You see whatever wave this was. That only happens if everybody was infected at the same time. The ending is not as hopeful as you think. And then you think back, Frank represents the futileness of hoping for the future, that it's pointless and that death is really the only release for any of them. But then if you stop and you think about it again, and you think about it from the point of view of the ending is happy, you look back and like you were talking about, we had the guy who was studying theology and he was able to recognize, no, if we stay sane and we stay aware of what's going on, we look at what's going on, the world is just going on around us and we are just, all in quarantine. We will be rescued. These planes are observing to see what's going on, to see if we can, okay, we're checking in. Have they died yet? Nope, they're still going. So everything is going on and from the rest of the world just fine. If we can just hold on to our hope, we will be rescued. And especially when you think about it in terms of the characters of Hannah and Frank. Hannah didn't have the hope that her dad did when they first meet, because she even makes this comment of, or we could just die here in their little like apartment sort of thing. What's interesting is they also lured Selena and Jim to their apartment, much the same way that they were lured to the camp. However, if you look at it that way, that's a reminder that there are two different types of people in there. Yes, they needed them, but they didn't need them for any nefarious purposes. They needed people. They needed like armed strength to get through things.
Well, as Frank put it, Hannah and I could leave, but if something were to happen to me, then she'd be all alone. So exactly. He just needed more bodies, essentially, to make the trip to Manchester. So that's, I think, where he was coming from with that. But you're not wrong.
Like I said, there are two, and I think that's in a very intelligent design in a movie, to where it's a movie that can be read two totally opposite ways and have neither one of them essentially be wrong. It's all about what your personal worldview is how you will perceive this movie. If you have an optimistic outlook on life, yes, these horrible things are happening and all of England has essentially broken down and is falling apart, you will see the hope in the plane and the hope in the ending. If you are a pessimistic person, you will look at this movie and you will see nothing but death as sweet relief. And I think that's brilliant that was done like that. And I have mad respect for the writer and the director for doing that. I will say though, I wish, this is just me from a moviegoer perspective, I wish the opening where we see where the disease comes from didn't happen. And just because I would think it would be kind of cool to not know what started this, because at least we'd put us directly in the character's shoes with Jim and Cindy, because they don't know how it started. They just know it's been going on for 28 days. I thought that would have been kind of cool.
I think it sort of sets the stage for like I said, the virus is sort of meant to represent kind of just rage. Like that's what they call it and stuff. And as you can see, like they sort of, code it with, footage of riots and things like that. So I think that was sort of important. And also like just how rash behavior can turn something into a catastrophe.
Yeah.
The scientist is telling them, like, I know what you're here to do, but you don't understand. And we're still studying this thing. You have to understand. And it's just out of rage. They let rage out. And that's kind of the thing I was getting at with this movie. Well, first of all, before I get into like my final thoughts, just another side note, you mentioned like some religious, like with the church and stuff. Did you notice that there are actually some religious hymns in the soundtrack? There's Ave Maria and there's two others. And they're played at some of those more serene moments in the movie. So you did notice. Gotcha.
I did notice that, and that really does kind of play into the message of that again. That's the thing that somebody who looks at this as a hopeful movie can use that as evidence that look, they have hope.
Absolutely.
The director has hope. He put this music in here.
But I suggested this movie because of the virus, and surprisingly, it had to do with a lot of things going on. Everyone's quarantining. Everyone's mad. There's lots of crazy stuff in the news going on, and it's just hard to be hopeful anymore. And so, despite the dark subject matter of this movie, I think that is kind of the message, is to be more like Jim and be the one that will help out someone who's struggling and look for the silver lining and give someone the chance to survive instead of chopping them down in a heartbeat, and kind of pushing forward to make things better. And it's amazing like how much this movie actually kind of has, like it's got so many similarities to things going on currently. So I'm very happy I recommended it, and I'm glad you were able to push through it.
I actually was texting Whiskey during this, and I was like, I don't think I'll be able to finish this.
And this was yesterday, and I was like,
well, you should have said something before the day of. But overall, I did enjoy the movie. It's not one, I'm just not a zombie person, so it's not one I sit through again. However, if you are looking to get into the horror genre, or you're trying to get into specifically the zombie aspect of it, this is it's a very well-made movie. It's a well-written story. It's very tense, but it's very, in a way, soothing and a little cathartic for right now. And I would say I would give this a recommend, as long as the person's not pessimistic. I would give them a recommend. This was a very good movie, and you have fantastic taste.
Highly recommend it. If everyone is copying something to the point where it gets annoying, you should seek out patient zero, so to speak, and watch or listen to whatever is being copied. Seek it out, because there's probably a reason it's being copied, and this is a prime example of that. Highly recommend it. Also going to put out there, if you think that we missed the boat on some other virus movie, or something that you would like us to talk about, be sure to leave it down in the comments, tweet at us. We'll totally talk about any movie you guys want to talk about, so be sure to let us know.
Go ahead, reach out to us, tweet at us, let us know your thoughts. If we missed it, if I was completely off, or if Whiskey was off, or if we were right on the money, let us know. I'll go ahead and leave you with what my dad's first words were before I saw this movie. Sometimes it's good to just lie on your back. Thanks, everybody. We will catch you in the next one. Reels on the Rocks is a production of La Prince Laboratories. It is edited and produced by Alejandro Castillo, with original artwork by Asa Esparza. Follow us on Twitter at Reels on the Rocks, and tweet at us any movies or shows you'd like us to discuss in the future.